Hello and welcome to Wingin It. So here we are. It has been a long time coming, but we have the long-awaited sixth part of the maths behind Wingspan. So yeah, for those of you who followed along with the original series, you'll know I was taking a look at various mathematical elements of Wingspan, taking a very basic look at things like probabilities and expected values to help players improve their decision making when playing Wingspan. So yeah, those first 5 parts were put together exactly 1 year today. So I thought this was a good opportunity to revisit some of the new elements that we have in the European expansion. So, hang on a minute. Let me just fix that background. There we go. That's much better. Get the purple in there for the European expansion. So yeah, for each of those 5 parts, I took a look at 5 different areas of Wingspan. So we took a look at hunting powers, we took a look at some dice rolling abilities, card drawing abilities, bonus cards, and end of round goals. So we're going to take a look at through each of those 5 elements here today in this video, and what has changed with each of those, with any new powers that were introduced with the European expansion. So of course, to start that off, we'll take a look at what we took a look at in that first video, which is the hunting powers. So in terms of new brown powers, there aren't really too many to look at. The real main introduction of new hunting powers in the European expansion were the white hunting powers, the when played powers. So, of course, we have birds like Benelli's Eagle, where you get to pay with cards instead of food cost. We also have birds like the Red Kite, where instead of paying any costs, you play on top of an existing bird on your player mat. So, yeah, not really too much probabilities or any sort of mathematical element here. You just work out, is it worth playing? In the case of something like Benelli's Eagle, normally is. But yeah, no real randomness involved here. But we do have a couple of new brown powers. So first of all, we've got the Northern Gannet, which is very similar to some of the dice rolling powers in the base game. And we also have the Eleanor's Falcon, which likewise is similar, but with a slightly different payout. So we'll take a look at each of these 2 new brown powers. And yeah, for those of you who did watch the original part looking at dice rolling powers, you'll know that we have an expectation table that looks like this. So depending on how many dice you roll, depending how many are outside the feeder. And for the base game powers, the return looks like this. So for the Eleanor's Falcon, it's exactly the same. You're rolling a number of dice. The only difference is you're getting eggs instead of cached food. So you might have your opinion on whether cached food is preferred to eggs or whether eggs is preferred to cached food. But in terms of expected return there, it is exactly the same. Now, when we take a look at the Gannet, it's a little bit different. There's a little bit more going on. So we need a slightly bigger table. So, of course, with the Gannet, you're still rolling dice, but if you roll more than 1 fish, you get to cash that many fish. So in the base game, you could roll 4 fish and you'd only get 1. But here, if you roll 4, you're getting 4 fish. So definitely some potential upside there. But very similar looking table. We've got the number of dice rolling down the left-hand side, and then the probability of rolling a certain number of fish along the top in each of those columns. So we'll start off simple. We'll look at 1 dice. So this is the same scenario as before. Of course, you can roll at most 1 fish, so you're going to get that number of fish cashed anyway. And we know, looking before, the probability of rolling 1 is 0.167, and so we can just subtract that from 1 to get the probability of rolling none, which is going to be 0.833. And then just combining those all, we get an expectation, of course, of 0.167, which, as I said, is the same as with the base game powers. Now, when we start to look at 2 dice, it's when it gets a little bit more interesting. So, of course, as I said, you can roll 1, but you can also roll 2 fish, as unlikely as that might seem. So, with a bit of standard probability binomial distribution stuff, we can get the probability here of rolling 2 fish, where you've got 2 dice, 1 in 6 chance of either of them being a fish. So when you combine those 2, 1 over 6 times 1 over 6, you get 1 over 36, which here is that 0.028 value. And then similarly, we can work out probability of rolling 1 and 0 from that. And now when we look at the expectation, instead of just adding these numbers, we take a sum product. So we do 0.278 times by the 1 fish, and then we add 0.028 times 2 fish, because of course on that 0.028 chance of rolling 2 fish we do get 2, so we get a slightly higher expectation than what we had in the base game here, 0.333, so 1 in 3 is what you're going to expect there. And I'm not going to go through exactly how it is for 3 and 4, but it's very similar. So we get expectations here of 0.5 when you roll 3 dice, and for 4 dice an expectation of 0.667. So this is most useful when compared to the base game powers, and you'll see the more dice you roll, the greater the difference between your expectation for the Northern Gannet power and those in the base game. And I think that kind of intuitively makes sense. You know, you're rolling more dice and you're going to get more fish when you cash, when you roll successfully more of those dice to show up fish. So yeah, the real question is going to be, how much of a difference does that make in the game? You know, is that increase, particularly when you're looking at rolling 3 or 4 dice? It's quite a substantial difference there in terms of the expectation. So is that going to play out when you're actually using these powers in the game? So we'll take a look at a good comparison here between the Northern Gannet and the Inhinga here. So the Inhinga being from the base game, where you just gain 1 fish, and then of course, as I was saying, the Gannet, where you get to cash more. And yeah, really sort of comparing across the two, you know, you're going to see at that top end, when you're rolling 4 dice, 0.667 compared to 0.518, it's about 0.15 difference per activation, which is sort of 1 in 6, 1 in 7. And so essentially, even at that top end, even when you're rolling 4 dice every single time, you're only going to get 1 extra fish on average every 6 or 7 activations. If you think about how many times you actually activate these birds, 6 or 7 is probably at the top end. You're probably not likely to be activating these in your wetlands more often than that. And given the fact that the Inhinga already starts with a 1-point advantage, being 6 compared to 5, and even has an extra egg slot, it's probably not going to be worth playing that Gannet. You know, you're going to be relying on some really lucky rolls to get some additional fish. And hey, if you like a gamble, you know, if you like that sort of push your luck style, then maybe you favour the Gannet. But I think in general, the Inhinga is going to take the advantage here with still not a terrible power, but that extra victory point to start with. So we can move on here and take a look at the next part, which was the second part we looked at in this series, which is food gaining power. So we have quite a few new ones here in the European expansion. Some of them that work quite similarly to those in the base game, but some that work very differently. So I'm taking a look at each of the 5 that we're going to view here. We have the Black Woodpecker, gain all worms in the bird feeder. Bullfinch, reset the bird feeder if you do gain a seed or a cherry from the bird feeder. European Bee Eater, very similar, reset the bird feeder. This time you gain worms. European Honey Buzzard is a round end power. Reset the bird feeder if you do gain all the worms in the bird feeder after resetting. And finally, we've got the Hawfinch, reset the bird feeder if you do gain a seed after resetting. So before we get into looking at each of those, I'm going to revisit the table that we had in that original video looking at the food gaining powers. So this is a pretty straightforward table. For each of the food types, it tells you how likely you are to get that number of that food type when resetting the bird feeder. So you can see for worms and seeds, it's the same because you have for each of them 1 dice face that has that food type, and then you also have the multiple worm/seed food types. So you're slightly more likely to get those than the other food types, the cherry, the fish, and the rodents that only have 1 of each. And then in that original part, we did also condense that table slightly to a more straightforward one that looks at how likely you are to get none, how likely you are to get more than that, so at least 1, and how likely you are to get more than 1, and then the expected value for each. So yeah, that expectation, 1.667 in the case of worms and seeds, and 0.833 in the case of the other foods. So that is going to come in handy when looking at the usefulness of these new powers. So we'll start by looking at the worm gaining powers. These all are kind of similar to each other, but slightly different. So just looking at that column, looking at worms, we have the breakdown here of how likely you are to get each number of these. Now this is particularly useful to look at when you're looking at the Black Woodpecker and the European Honey Buzzard. So the Honey Buzzard, pretty straightforward. You're always resetting the bird feeder there and gaining all the worms. Black Woodpecker slightly different, but I think in most scenarios when you're using this, you're going to try and set it up so that you can re-roll before you activate that power and see how many worms you're going to get. So This shows you're most likely to get 1 or 2, as we kind of know from that original part, but there are chances there for you to get 3 or more. But yeah, Bee Eater, much more straightforward. Reset the bird feeder if you do gain 1. So you don't really care in that case. If you're getting more than 1, you just want to get at least 1. So we can kind of, again, shift the perspective here in this table, where we look at how likely we are to gain at least 1, or at least 2, or at least 3 in each case. And you can see, as we found out before, probability of getting at least 1, 0.868. So about 87% of the time, you're going to get at least 1 worm. But then again, when you're using birds like the woodpecker and the honey buzzard, you can see you're more than 50% of the time, you're going to get at least 2. So you've got a pretty good chance there of getting some worms, multiple worms on those rerolls when you're using those powers. Next up, we'll take a look at the Hawfinch. So this is another pretty straightforward power. Reset the bird feeder if you do gain a seed after resetting. So like the Bee Eater, we don't really care so much if there are more than 1 seed in the bird feeder. So we can condense this down pretty straightforwardly to, am I going to roll 0 or am I going to roll 1 or more? And again, as with worms that we looked at before, 0.868, about 87% of the time, you're going to get a seeded. So you're pretty likely to get a good activation result off of this Hawfinch. Next up, we'll take a look at the Bullfinch. Now, this is a bit more complicated because we have a choice. We can gain a seed or a cherry, so it's a bit like the Hawfinch, but you get more flexibility. And with that flexibility, you get more chances to get food. So, of course, if you're looking at specifically a seed or specifically a cherry, you just take a look at the relevant column from the table before. But it's slightly different when we combine the two. You'll see that actually, you're quite unlikely to not roll any seeds or cherries. Only 0.031 probability, so about 3% of the time. And again, as with looking at the Hawfinch, we can condense that down into just 2 pretty simple rows. Am I going to roll 0 or am I going to roll at least 1? And there you go. If you're looking for just seeds, it's the same as the Hawfinch. If you're looking for just cherries, it's still 60% of the time. So pretty good probability there. But of course, if you just want some food from this activation, 97% of the time, you're going to get at least 1. Only 3%, as I said, is going to miss. So that is a really good probability. That's why this bird has such a good power. So next up, we are going to take a look at the card drawing powers, which was the third part in this series when we're looking at the base game. And we have 4 main new types here. So we've got powers like this white-throated dipper, discard all remaining face-up cards and refill the tray if you do draw one of the new face-up cards. We've got birds like the Wilson Storm Petrel, draw 1 card for each empty card slot on this row at the end of your turn, keep 1 and discard the rest. And then we also have these other 2 new powers, the Common Little Bittern and the Squacko Heron, where you're gaining face-up cards depending on which habitats they can live in. And those last 2 are the ones of most interest to us, so we're going to take a closer look here at those 2 card drawing powers in particular. So we have 261 cards between the base game and the Swift Start and the European expansion. 125 of those can live in the grasslands, and 126 can live in the wetlands. But if we're using that Squacko Heron power, of course, one of those 126 is the Squacko Heron itself. So in terms of actually using that power, in terms of cards you can draw with it, there's 125. So it's going to be the same in both cases, and we can look at that as 125 out of the remaining 260, of course, excluding the bird that we are activating from the calculation. It's about 48%, so we'll call it about 50%. In general, when you're thinking about this, about half of the cards in the deck are going to be eligible to be picked up with these powers. Now, of course, when you're looking at drawing cards in the tray, there are going to be 3 cards to choose from. So if we're going to look at how likely we are to miss on this kind of power, we look at 0.52, so that's the inverse of the probability of actually getting a card that meets it. 52% of the time we're going to get a card that doesn't meet this. And then if that's going to happen 3 times, that is going to happen 14% of the time. And so of course that then tells us that a tray refresh is going to give us a card, a good card in this case, we consider to be one that can be picked up with this power 86% of the time. And so that's reasonably likely, but of course when you compare it to other card drawing powers, which always work because you're not looking to pick up a certain card, it's maybe not quite as good. So that maybe gives you some idea why birds like the Squacko Heron and the Common Little Bittern potentially don't quite see as much play as those other card drawing powers that we see. Next up, we're going to look at what we looked at in part 4 of the original series, and that is bonus cards. So we of course have 5 brand new bonus cards introduced as part of the European expansion. We have the Behaviourist, the Bird Bander, the Citizen Scientist, the Diet Specialist, and the Ethologist. So if you saw that original part 4 where we looked at bonus cards, we took a look at some of the probabilities. We kind of analysed how many cards you might be playing, how many birds you might get down on your player map, and then of course on the bottom of some of these cards we have the percentage of cards in the deck that meet those. And so we use that to look at, okay, if I'm playing this many birds, how many of them are likely to meet these bonus cards? And then kind of extended that onto how likely am I, if I play that many birds, to score this many points off each bonus card, and then kind of through all those scenarios get a good idea of, okay, what's the average return from each bonus card? And as part of that, there were 3 kind of key metrics, I think, that I looked at, which were how many points are you going to get on average from each bonus card? How many points do you get per bird played for that bonus card? And then also looking at birds that meet each bonus card, how many points are they worth on average? So you get a good sense of, if I'm playing a bird that meets this, how many points is that bird on its own? And then how many points can I get from that bonus card as well? So I'd recommend you check out that original video for some of the kind of logic and reasoning and some of the calculations behind that, because I'm not going to revisit that here. I just want to kind of quickly go through these bonus cards. But really there's only 2 here that we can analyse, that being the Bird Bander and the Diet Specialist, because those are ones that actually really matter based on the cards that you played. Citizen Scientist sort of does, but you need to actually get tuck cards on the birds that you're playing, so it's a little bit harder to analyse. And of course Behaviourist and Ethologist, they're much more dependent on the order and which habitats and which columns certain birds are played in, so it's a little bit harder to analyse those, so I'm not going to look at those in any great detail. But as I said, we can at least look at 2 of these bonus cards, the first of which being the Bird Bander. So yeah, we have 3 metrics here. We have the expected points, we have the points per bird, and we have the average victory point per bird that qualifies for this. So in the Bird Bander case, we have 2.1 expected points, 0.43 points per bird, and 3.58 average victory points per bird that qualifies. So yeah, as I said, it'd be useful to check out that original video for some good comparisons, but this is slightly below average. Generally, bonus cards have about 2.5 expected points, so this is definitely slightly below that. And in terms of points per bird, this is very much middle of the road, at around 0.4, 0.5 points per bird. And even the average victory point, again, it's about middle of the road. But I think you'd expect that from this kind of bonus card. It's not restricting in terms of how many points or anything like that. It's birds that can live in multiple habitats, and that generally is pretty broad range that kind of is represented across birds of all values, regardless of whether they're high victory point birds or low victory point birds. So decent bonus card, but nothing special. Next we can look at Diet Specialist. So again, these 3 metrics. Here we have a 2.79 expected points, 0.97 points per bird, and 5.55 average victory points per bird that meets this bonus card. So you'll notice these numbers are much higher. As I said, about 2.5 is the average expected points per bonus card from my original calculation. So this definitely above average. And again, 0.97 points per bird, definitely above average there. So this is a good bonus card. And 5.55 average victory points per bird that meets this. I think that kind of makes intuitive sense here. These are birds with a food cost of 3 food. Those are normally high victory point birds. Those 7, 8, 9 point birds that you'd be able to play at the end of the game. So yeah, to play 4 of those, you're going to score a lot of points just by playing those birds, but also potentially get 6 points here. So definitely a good bonus card. And so kind of in summary, just to look at across these 5 bonus cards, obviously we have those 2 where we have a little bit more kind of objectivity here, but I also have some subjective opinions that I'm going to include here. So in summary, Diet Specialist and Ethologist, good bonus cards. We have Bird Bander, which is okay, and then we have Behaviourist and Citizen Scientist, which I would say are bad bonus cards. And finally, we can take a look at what we looked at in part 5 of the original series, and that is the end of round goals. So again, like bonus cards, we have a few new end of round goal tiles included in the European expansion. So we have brown powers, we have birds with no eggs, we have fill columns, food cost of played birds, cards in hand, white and no powers, birds with more than 4 points, birds in 1 row, birds with tuck cards, and food in personal supply. Now the big thing that I looked at in the original video was looking at how many of these relate to egg laying in some way. And in the base game, there were lots of those. And you'll notice here, there are not many. In fact, there's only one that is related to egg laying. And it is actually birds with no eggs, so very much kind of the opposite of what we saw in the base game. So yeah, looking a little bit more closely, as I said, in the base game, 12 out of those 16 are egg related in some way. And then I took a quick look at, okay, how likely you are to get a certain number of end of round goals that are egg related. And you'll see that from this table that I've carried over from that original part, you're very likely to get 2, 3, or 4 egg end of round goals. So average is about 3, which makes sense because about 3 and 4 of those are egg related. And yeah, you're very much likely to see those egg end of round goals. And I think that goes some way to explaining why egg laying is so important in the base game, not just to score points by generating eggs and having a strong engine there, but also to hit a lot of these end of round goals. Now, if we look at the European expansion, of course, as I said, we only have those original 12. I'm not going to include the birds with no eggs because, as I said, that's actually discouraging you from laying eggs in any sense. So yeah, we have 10 new end of round goals and none of them being egg related, so only 12 out of 26 here. And so it should be no surprise really to see that the probability of seeing multiple egg end of round goals drops quite dramatically, and there's very much a shift here towards the lower end. Now on average you're getting less than 2 really. You're quite likely to see 1 or 2, but seeing 4 egg end of round goals, only 3%, so very much towards that lower end. And again, I think this gives a good indication as to why maybe when you play the European expansion you kind of don't see egg laying being such a key strategy. Obviously it still scores points and there are still some strong engines that you can build in the grasslands, but those end of round goals maybe don't come into play quite so much in that decision making. And so there we go, that was all I was going to look at here. Hopefully that was a good whistle stop tour of the important mathematical aspects I feel that were introduced in the European expansion, and I'm glad that after a long year's wait I was able to come and revisit this. So yeah, thank you everyone for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed that, and yeah, I'm going to look to post more of these strategy style videos. I'm going to incorporate those alongside the gameplay stuff as well. So if that kind of stuff interests you, then please do consider hitting that subscribe button and you'll get to stay up to date with all those future gameplay and strategy videos that come out